The fins sliced through the water like a knife through silk, leaving ripples of terror in its wake. The beach cameras captured its first appearance, nearly 20 feet of dorsal fin alone. Experts argued it had to be a technical malfunction or elaborate hoax, until the second sighting brought undeniable evidence of something worse. The creature moved with impossible speed for its massive size. Underwater microphones picked up vocalizations that matched no known marine species. Each attack left less and less evidence, as if it was learning to hunt more efficiently. The pattern of disappearances traced a deliberate path up the coastline. Local legends spoke of an ancient guardian awakening from its slumber. The truth would prove far more terrifying than any myth. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The scorching Mexican sun beat down on the small group of tourists as they gathered at the marina in Playa del Carmen. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and sunscreen, a cacophony of excited chatter, and the gentle lapping of waves against the dock filling the air. Sarah Matthews, a 28-year-old elementary school teacher from San Diego, adjusted her sun hat and squinted at the crystalline waters stretching out before her. She'd been looking forward to this snorkeling trip for months, a much-needed escape from the pressures of her demanding job and recent breakup. Yet, as she stood there, a nagging sense of unease tugged at the corners of her mind. "You okay there, Sarah?" A warm hand touched her shoulder, startling her from her reverie. She turned to see Mark, a fellow tourist she'd befriended on the flight over, his easy smile a stark contrast to her own tense expression. Sarah forced a smile. "Yeah, just a little nervous, I guess. It's been a while since I've been in the ocean." Mark chuckled, his sun-weathered face crinkling at the corners. "Don't worry, we've got a pro to keep us safe. Speaking of which, here he comes now." A lean, bronze-skinned man in his early 30s approached the group, his gait confident and relaxed. He wore board shorts and a rash guard, a whistle dangling from his neck. "Buenos dias, everyone. I'm Carlos, and I'll be your guide for today's snorkeling adventure. Before we begin, let's go over some important safety procedures." As Carlos launched into his briefing, Sarah found her attention drifting. Her eyes roamed over the other members of their small group, a honeymooning couple from Minnesota, giggling and stealing kisses. An older gentleman with a camera around his neck, hanging on Carlos's every word, and a mother with her teenage son, both looking as apprehensive as Sarah felt. "And remember, it's crucial to stay with the group at all times," Carlos was saying, his accent lending a musical quality to his words. "The currents can be unpredictable, and it's easy to drift away without realizing it. Any questions?" The older man with the camera raised his hand. "What about sharks? Should we be worried?" A ripple of nervous laughter went through the group. Carlos smiled reassuringly. "While there are sharks in these waters, attacks are extremely rare. We'll be staying in areas where encounters are unlikely. Just remember, we're visitors in their home, so we must respect the marine life." Sarah felt her stomach churn. She'd read about a few shark incidents in the area before the trip but had dismissed them as freak occurrences. Now, standing at the edge of the vast, unknown ocean, those stories came flooding back. "All right, folks, if there are no more questions, let's get on board." Carlos gestured towards a sleek speedboat bobbing gently at the dock. "We've got some amazing underwater sights waiting for us." As the group filed onto the boat, Sarah hesitated. Mark noticed her reluctance and offered his hand. "Come on, Sarah. It'll be fun, I promise. And if you get scared, I'll be right there with you." Swallowing her fear, Sarah took his hand and stepped onto the boat. The engine roared to life, and they were off, slicing through the turquoise waters towards the snorkeling site. The wind whipped through Sarah's hair, carrying with it the salty tang of adventure and the faintest hint of danger. Carlos's voice carried over the rush of wind and waves. We're heading to a beautiful reef about 20 minutes out. The water's exceptionally clear today, so we should have great visibility. As they sped along, Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. The beauty of the coastline was undeniable, pristine beaches giving way to lush jungle, the occasional resort peeking out from the greenery. She closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her face and the excitement of the other passengers wash over her. All too soon, the boat began to slow. Sarah opened her eyes to find they had arrived at their destination. The water here was impossibly blue, so clear she could see the colorful coral formations below even from the boat. "Okay, everyone," Carlos called out, clapping his hands to get their attention. "We'll enter the water one at a time. Remember to adjust your mask and snorkel before getting in, and don't forget to breathe normally through your mouth. I'll be in the water first to help guide you." Sarah watched as Carlos gracefully slipped into the water, followed by the honeymooning couple and the older man with the camera. The mother and son went next, the boy's initial trepidation quickly giving way to excited splashing. "Ready?" Mark asked, already half into his flippers. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. She pulled on her flippers and adjusted her mask, the rubber strap catching on her hair. With trembling hands, she inserted the snorkel mouthpiece. "You've got this?" Mark encouraged, giving her a thumbs up before sliding into the water with barely a splash. Taking a deep breath, Sarah sat on the edge of the boat. The captain gave her a reassuring nod. "Just relax and enjoy, señorita. The water is perfect today." With one final moment of hesitation, Sarah pushed off and plunged into the warm Caribbean waters. The initial shock of submersion quickly gave way to wonder as she opened her eyes. Beneath the surface, a whole new world revealed itself. Schools of brightly colored fish darted around her, their scales shimmering in the filtered sunlight. The coral reef stretched out before her, a living tapestry of purples, greens, and oranges. Carlos's voice, muffled by the water, called out to the group, "Stay together and follow me. We'll explore the edge of the reef first." Sarah fell in line with the others, her initial fears fading as she became entranced by the underwater spectacle. She watched in awe as a sea turtle glided by, its ancient eyes seeming to regard her with curious indifference. For a moment, she forgot about everything else, her job, her ex, her anxieties, lost in the serene beauty of the reef. As they swam, Sarah found herself drifting slightly away from the group, drawn by the mesmerizing dance of a school of angelfish. She didn't notice at first how far she'd strayed, too captivated by the vibrant marine life surrounding her. It was then that she felt it, a subtle shift in the water around her. A shadow passed beneath her, just at the edge of her vision. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as she whipped around, trying to locate the source of the movement. But there was nothing there, just the endless blue stretching out in all directions. Suddenly aware of her isolation, Sarah looked up, searching for the rest of the group. They were some distance away now. Carlos's distinctive yellow rash guard a beacon in the water. She began to swim towards them, her movements becoming more frantic as she realized how far she drifted. That's when she saw it, a large, dark shape moving through the water with purposeful grace. It was still far off, but even at this distance, Sarah could make out the distinctive shape of a shark. Her blood ran cold as she remembered Carlos's words. "We're visitors in their home." Sarah tried to call out, but her voice was muffled by the snorkel and the enveloping water. She waved her arms frantically, hoping to catch someone's attention. To her relief, she saw Carlos turn and spot her. He immediately began swimming in her direction, gesturing for her to stay calm and move slowly towards the group. But as Sarah tried to control her panicked breathing and make her way back, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes upon her. The shark, unseen but present, circling ever closer in the vast blue expanse. The paradise she had marveled at just moments ago now felt like a trap, with danger lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. As Carlos drew nearer, his face a mask of concern, Sarah realized that their perfect day in paradise had taken a dark turn. The true test of survival was just beginning, and the idyllic waters of Playa del Carmen were about to reveal their hidden perils. As Sarah struggled to maintain her composure, Carlos reached her side, his eyes scanning the water around them. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice muffled by the snorkel but tinged with concern. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to convey her fear with her eyes alone. "Let's rejoin the group," Carlos said calmly, gently taking her arm. "Remember?" Slow and steady movements. They began swimming back towards the others, who had clustered together, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares, but her focus remained on the vast blue expanse surrounding them, searching for any sign of the dark shape she'd seen earlier. As they neared the group, Mark swam out to meet them. "Sarah, what happened? Are you all right?" Before she could answer, Carlos interjected. "Everyone, please stay close together." Sarah thought she saw something in the water. "It's probably nothing, but we're going to head back to the boat as a precaution." The words had barely left his mouth when a collective gasp rippled through the group. About 50 yards away, a large triangular fin broke the surface of the water, cutting through it with ominous purpose. "Shark!" someone screamed, the sound piercing even through the water. Panic erupted instantly. The honeymooning couple clutched each other tightly, their eyes wide with terror. The teenage boy began hyperventilating through his snorkel, his mother trying desperately to calm him while fighting her own fear. "Everyone, remain calm," Carlos shouted, his voice carrying an authority that momentarily silenced the group. "We're going to make our way back to the boat slowly and together. No splashing, no sudden movements. Stay close to me." Sarah felt a hand grasp hers and turned to see Mark, his face pale but determined. "We'll be okay," he mouthed around his snorkel, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. As the group began to move, Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the fin. It had disappeared beneath the surface, but she knew the shark was still there, unseen but present. The crystal-clear water that had seemed so inviting just moments ago now felt like a transparent prison, offering no place to hide. They moved as one unit, Carlos leading the way with slow, deliberate strokes. Sarah could hear the ragged breathing of her fellow tourists through their snorkels, a chorus of fear accompanying their retreat. Suddenly, the older man with the camera let out a muffled cry. His snorkel had filled with water, and he was coughing and sputtering, creating a series of small splashes. "Help him," Carlos commanded, and Mark immediately moved to assist, supporting the man as he cleared his snorkel. The commotion, however brief, sent a ripple of terror through the group. Sarah's eyes darted around frantically, searching for any sign of the shark. That's when she saw it, a massive gray form gliding through the water with terrible grace, heading directly towards them. "Carlos!" she screamed through her snorkel, pointing. The guide's head snapped around, his eyes widening as he spotted the approaching predator. "Everyone to the boat, now!" he yelled, abandoning all pretense of calm. The group surged forward, their earlier caution forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Sarah's muscles burned as she pushed herself harder than she ever had before, the boat seeming impossibly far away. She could hear the sound of splashing behind her, knew without looking that the shark was closing in. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to keep swimming, keep breathing. "Almost there," Carlos encouraged, his voice strained. "Keep going." Sarah could see the boat now, the captain leaning over the side, his face a mask of horror as he realized what was happening. She reached out, her fingers straining towards safety, when suddenly she felt a powerful rush of water from behind. Time seemed to slow. Sarah turned her head, coming face to face with the nightmare she'd been fleeing. The bull shark was mere feet away, its black eyes fixed upon her with predatory intensity. She could see every detail, the rows of serrated teeth, the rough, sandpaper-like skin, the powerful muscles rippling beneath its streamlined body. In that moment, Sarah was certain she was going to die. Then Carlos was there, placing himself between Sarah and the shark. "Dow!" he shouted, pushing her towards the boat. Sarah's hand found the ladder, and she pulled herself up with strength born of pure adrenaline. Hands reached down, grabbing her and hauling her aboard. She collapsed on the deck, gasping and sobbing. One by one, the other tourists were pulled from the water. The honeymooning couple, the mother and her son, the older man with the camera, all made it safely aboard, though their faces were pale and shell-shocked. "Where's Carlos?" Mark gasped as he was helped onto the boat. Sarah scrambled to the side, her heart in her throat as she scanned the water. For a terrifying moment, she saw nothing but the empty blue of the Caribbean. Then, about 20 yards out, Carlos surfaced, waving his arm. "He's there," Sarah cried, pointing. The captain immediately began maneuvering the boat towards the guide. As they drew closer, Sarah could see the strain on Carlos's face, the way he was favoring his left side as he swam. "Hurry!" Mark shouted to the captain. The shark could come back any second. Just as they reached Carlos, a dark shape appeared in the water behind him. Without thinking, Sarah reached out, grabbing Carlos's arm and pulling with all her might. Mark joined her, and together they hauled the guide aboard mere seconds before the massive jaws of the bull shark snapped shut where he had been. Carlos collapsed on the deck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Is everyone okay?" he managed to ask between breaths. Sarah looked around at the group. They were all there, all alive, but the terror of what they just experienced was etched deeply on every face. The honeymooning couple held each other, sobbing quietly. The teenage boy was curled up in his mother's arms, shaking uncontrollably. The older man sat with his head in his hands, his camera forgotten. As the captain gunned the engine, speeding them back towards the shore, Sarah became aware of a stinging sensation in her leg. Looking down, she saw a long gash running down her calf, a parting gift from the shark's rough skin as it had passed by her. The sight of her own blood made the reality of what had just happened crash down upon her. "Oh God," she whispered, her body beginning to shake as the adrenaline wore off and shock set in. Mark was at her side in an instant, wrapping a towel around her shoulders. "It's okay, Sarah. We're safe now. We made it." But as Sarah looked out at the now peaceful waters, the idyllic blue hiding the terror that lurked beneath, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The carefree joy of the morning seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a newfound understanding of nature's raw power and indifference. As the coastline of Playa del Carmen came into view, Sarah closed her eyes, trying to shut out the image of those black, soulless eyes that had regarded her with such primal hunger. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her core, that it was an image that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The day that had started with such promise had turned into a nightmare, and as the boat sped towards the safety of the shore, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. The physical danger might have passed, but the true impact of their brush with death was only just beginning to unfold. The boat cut through the waves at top speed, the engine roaring as the captain pushed it to its limits. Sarah clung to the railing, her knuckles white, the wind whipping her salt-crusted hair across her face. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape was fading, leaving her trembling and nauseous. "We're almost there," Mark shouted over the engine's roar, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Just hold on a little longer." Sarah nodded weakly, unable to form words. Her eyes were fixed on the approaching shoreline, willing it to come closer faster. Behind her, she could hear the muffled sobs of the honeymooning couple and the labored breathing of Carlos, who was sprawled on the deck, clutching his side. As they neared the marina, Sarah saw a flurry of activity on the dock. Word of their encounter had clearly spread. A crowd had gathered, including what looked like medical personnel and local authorities. The captain skillfully maneuvered the boat into its berth. Before they had even fully stopped, Hands were reaching out to help them disembark. Sarah felt herself being lifted onto the dock, her legs too shaky to support her weight. "Ma'am, are you injured?" a paramedic asked, his eyes scanning her body efficiently. Sarah tried to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. She looked down at her leg, suddenly remembering the gash she'd received. The towel wrapped around it was soaked through with blood. "She's hurt," Mark answered for her, his voice tight with worry. "Her leg, the shark grazed her." The paramedic nodded, calling over his shoulder for a stretcher. Sarah wanted to protest, to say she could walk, but the world was starting to spin around her. She felt herself being lowered onto the stretcher, voices buzzing around her like angry bees. "Carlos," she managed to croak out. "Is Carlos okay?" "We're taking care of him, señorita," someone assured her. "Try to relax." As they wheeled her towards a waiting ambulance, Sarah caught glimpses of the chaos around her. The teenage boy was wrapped in a shock blanket, his mother hovering nearby. The older man with the camera was talking animatedly to what looked like a police officer, and Carlos, Sarah's heart clenched when she saw him. He was on another stretcher, his left side covered in blood. "Mark," Sarah reached out, grabbing his hand as he walked alongside her stretcher. "Don't leave me. I'm right here," he reassured her, squeezing her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and rapid-fire Spanish. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in her leg growing more intense as the shock wore off. She was vaguely aware of N4 being inserted, of gentle hands cleaning and examining her wound. At the hospital, everything moved with dizzying speed. Sarah found herself in an examination room, a doctor peering at her leg with a furrowed brow. "You're very lucky, Ms. Matthews," the doctor said, his accent thick but his English clear. "The wound is deep, but it missed any major blood vessels. We'll need to clean it thoroughly and stitch it up. There's always a risk of infection with marine injuries, so we'll start you on a course of antibiotics as well." Sarah nodded numbly. "What about Carlos, our guide? Is he okay?" The doctor's expression grew grave. "Your guide is in surgery now. The shark, it did more damage to him, but he's strong, and our surgical team is excellent. We're doing everything we can." A lump formed in Sarah's throat. Carlos had put himself between her and the shark. If he died because of that, Sarah, Mark's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. He was standing in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "They said I could come in. How are you holding up?" Sarah started to say fine, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, a sob escaped her, then another. Suddenly, she was crying uncontrollably, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Mark was at her side in an instant, gathering her into his arms. "It's okay," he murmured, stroking her hair. "Let it out. You're safe now." For several minutes, Sarah cried into Mark's chest, releasing all the fear and tension she'd been holding in. The doctor and nurses stepped out, giving them privacy. When her sobs finally subsided, Sarah pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry," she hiccuped. "I don't know what came over me." "You have nothing to apologize for," Mark said firmly. "What we went through, it was terrifying. Anyone would be shaken up." Sarah nodded, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "I keep seeing it," she whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see those black eyes, those teeth." "I know," Mark said softly. "Me too. But we survived, Sarah. We made it out." A knock at the door interrupted them. A police officer entered, his expression sympathetic but professional. "Ms. Matthews? I'm Officer Ramirez. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened today." Sarah straightened up, wincing as the movement sent a jolt of pain through her leg. "Of course," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. For the next hour, Sarah recounted the events of the day in painstaking detail. She described the initial sighting of the shark, The panic as they tried to reach the boat. The terrifying moment when she came face to face with the predator. Throughout it all, Mark stayed by her side, his presence a comforting anchor. "Thank you, Ms. Matthews," Officer Ramirez said when she finished. "Your account will be very helpful in our investigation. We'll be working with marine biologists to understand why the shark behaved so aggressively. It's unusual for bull sharks to attack in this area." As the officer left, the doctor returned to begin treating Sarah's wound. The process was painful, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was replaying the attack on an endless loop, each replay revealing new, horrifying details she hadn't noticed in the moment. "All done," the doctor announced, stepping back to examine his handiwork. "The stitches will need to stay in for about 2 weeks. You'll need to keep the wound clean and dry. No swimming," he added with a wry smile. Sarah managed a weak laugh. "I don't think that will be a problem," as the doctor gave her instructions for care and a prescription for antibiotics. A commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Sarah heard raised voices, one of which she recognized. "That's Mrs. Hernandez," she said to Mark. "The mother who was with us." Mark poked his head out into the hallway, then turned back to Sarah, his expression grim. "It's Carlos," he said. "He's out of surgery, but..." "It doesn't sound good." Sarah felt her heart drop. "What do you mean? What happened?" Before Mark could answer, Mrs. Hernandez appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. "The shark," she said, her voice breaking. "Didn't. It took his arm. They couldn't save it." The room fell silent, the weight of this new information settling over them like a heavy blanket. Sarah felt a fresh wave of tears threatening to overwhelm her. Carlos, who had risked his life to save them all, had paid a terrible price for his bravery. As the reality of the day's events truly began to sink in, Sarah realized that surviving the shark attack was only the beginning. The real challenge in dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath of this trauma was just beginning. And as she looked around at the shell-shocked faces of her fellow survivors, she knew that none of them would ever be the same again. The idyllic waters of Playa del Carmen had revealed their hidden dangers, shattering the illusion of paradise and leaving behind scars both visible and invisible. As the sun began to set outside her hospital window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, how does one move forward after staring death in the face and living to tell the tale? The hospital corridor buzzed with frantic energy as news of Carlos's condition spread among the survivors. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, her bandaged leg throbbing in time with her racing heart. She couldn't shake the image of Carlos's face as he'd pushed her towards safety. Moments before the shark struck, a commotion outside her room drew her attention. Through the partially open door, she saw the teenage boy. She now knew his name was Tyler, being wheeled past on a gurney, his mother Mrs. Hernandez hurrying alongside. "What's happening?" Sarah called out, her voice cracking with worry. Mark, who had been speaking with a nurse at the nurse's station, rushed back into the room. "Tyler's having some kind of panic attack," he explained, his face edged with concern. "They're taking him to a different ward for observation." Sarah felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. "This is all my fault," she whispered, her hands trembling. "If I hadn't drifted away from the group." "Stop that," Mark said firmly, sitting beside her on the bed. "You can't blame yourself for what happened. It was a freak accident." Before Sarah could respond, a tall man in a crisp white coat entered the room, followed by Officer Ramirez. "Ms. Matthews? I'm Dr. Alvarez, the chief of surgery." The man introduced himself. "I've just come from operating on your guide, Carlos." Sarah straightened up, ignoring the pain in her leg. "How is he? Will he be okay?" Dr. Alvarez's expression was grave. "Carlos lost a significant amount of blood, and as you may have heard, we were unable to save his left arm. However, he's stable now and in recovery." Officer Ramirez stepped forward. "Ms. Matthews, we need to ask for your help. Carlos is still unconscious, and we need to piece together exactly what happened out there. The other tourists are, well, they're not in a state to give coherent statements right now. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. Of course. What do you need to know? For the next hour, Sarah recounted the events of the day in excruciating detail. She described the initial sighting of the shark, the panic as they tried to reach the boat, and the terrifying moment when she came face to face with the predator. Throughout her account, Dr. Alvarez and Officer Ramirez listened intently, occasionally interrupting with questions. "And you're certain it was a bull shark?" Officer Ramirez asked, scribbling notes. Sarah nodded emphatically. "Yes, I remember Carlos mentioning it when we first saw the fin. He said something about bull sharks being common in the area but attacks being rare." Dr. Alvarez exchanged a look with the officer. "Bull sharks are indeed known to be in these waters, but an attack of this magnitude is highly unusual. We've contacted marine biologists from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico to assist with the investigation." As they continued to discuss the details, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Raised voices and the sound of running feet filled the air. Mark rushed to the door to see what was happening. "Oh God," he breathed, turning back to the room with wide eyes. "It's Carlos. He's awake and he's not taking it well." Dr. Alvarez immediately sprang into action, rushing out of the room. Officer Ramirez followed close behind, leaving Sarah and Mark alone. "I need to see him," Sarah said, attempting to stand. Her leg buckled beneath her, and she would have fallen if Mark hadn't caught her. "Whoa, easy there," he said, easing her back onto the bed. "You are in no condition to be walking around." Sarah shook her head, frustration and fear warring within her. "You don't understand. I need to thank him. He saved my life." Mark opened his mouth to argue further, but was interrupted by a nurse wheeling in a wheelchair. "Dr. Alvarez thought you might want this," she said with a knowing smile. Gratefully, Sarah allowed Mark and the nurse to help her into the wheelchair. As they made their way down the corridor towards the ICU, the sounds of distress grew louder. "Mi brazo. ¿Dónde está mi brazo?" Carlos's anguished cries echoed through the hallway. They rounded the corner to find a scene of chaos. Carlos was sitting up in his bed, his right hand clutching at the bandaged stump where his left arm had been. His face was a mask of pain and confusion, tears streaming down his cheeks as he struggled against the medical staff trying to calm him. "Carlos," Sarah called out, her voice breaking. "Carlos, I'm here." At the sound of her voice, Carlos's head snapped towards her. For a moment, his eyes were wild, unrecognizing. Then, slowly, clarity seemed to dawn. "Sarah?" he said, his voice hoarse. "You're alive? You're okay?" Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, thanks to you. You saved me, Carlos. You saved all of us." Carlos slumped back against his pillows, the fight seeming to drain out of him. "But at what cost?" he murmured, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his arm should have been. Dr. Alvarez stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Carlos, I know this is a shock, but you need to try to stay calm. Your body has been through a tremendous ordeal." Carlos nodded numbly, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "The others?" he asked. "Are they all safe?" "Yes," Sarah assured him. "Everyone made it back alive, thanks to you." A ghost of a smile flickered across Carlos's face, quickly replaced by a grimace of pain. Dr. Alvarez moved to adjust his likely increasing his pain medication. "Carlos," Officer Ramirez said, stepping closer to the bed. "I hate to do this now, but we need to know. Do you remember anything unusual about the shark? Anything that might explain why it attacked?" Carlos furrowed his brow, clearly struggling to recall through the haze of pain and medication. "It was bigger than usual," he said slowly, "and more aggressive. Bull sharks they don't usually." His voice trailed off as the sedatives began to take effect. Dr. Alvarez ushered everyone out of the room, promising to update them once Carlos was more stable. Back in Sarah's room, the gravity of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Mark paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Shark attacks are so rare, and for one to be this aggressive." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. Carlos said it was bigger than usual. Could it have been sick or something? Before Mark could respond, there was a knock at the door. The honeymoon couple, Lisa and David, entered hesitantly. "We heard Carlos woke up," Lisa said, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "How is he?" Sarah sighed heavily. "He's struggling. It's a lot to take in." David nodded, his arm protectively around his wife's shoulders. "We can't stop thinking about it," he said. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that fin cutting through the water." "I know," Sarah said softly. "Me too." They fell into a heavy silence, each lost in their own replays of the terrifying event. The tranquil waters that had promised a day of adventure had turned into a nightmare none of them could have imagined. Suddenly, Lisa straightened up, her eyes wide. "Oh God," she breathed. "The shark. What if it's still out there?" The thought sent a chill through the room. Sarah felt her heart rate spike, the heart monitor beside her bed beeping more rapidly. "The authorities will handle it," Mark said, trying to sound reassuring. "They'll probably have boats out searching the area, warning other tourists." But Sarah couldn't shake the image of the massive predator gliding through the water, its dead black eyes fixed on its next victim. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her core, that this was far from over. As night fell over Playa del Carmen, casting long shadows across the hospital room, the survivors of the shark attack found themselves bound together by their shared trauma. The peaceful vacation they had planned had been shattered, replaced by a nightmare that would haunt them long after their physical wounds had healed. And somewhere out in the darkness, in the vast expanse of the Caribbean Sea, a silent predator continued its relentless hunt, unaware of the chaos it had left in its wake. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Sarah drifted in and out of a restless sleep. Nightmares plagued her, filled with dark shapes moving beneath the surface and the flash of razor-sharp teeth. She jolted awake with a gasp, her heart racing. "Hey, it's okay." Mark's voice came from beside her bed. He'd been keeping vigil, refusing to leave her side. "You're safe. It was just a dream." Sarah took a shaky breath, trying to calm herself. "It felt so real," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I could feel it coming for me again." A gentle knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Alvarez entered, his face grave. "Ms. Matthews, Mr. Harris, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's been a development." Sarah sat up straighter, ignoring the twinge of pain in her leg. "What is it? Is Carlos okay?" Dr. Alvarez sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Carlos is stable, but that's not why I'm here. There's been another attack." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Where?" she managed to ask. "About 5 miles down the coast," Dr. Alvarez replied. "A group of scuba divers. 1 fatality, 2 severely injured." Mark cursed under his breath. "It's the same shark, isn't it?" Dr. Alvarez nodded grimly. "We believe so. The description matches, unusually large, extremely aggressive. The local authorities are in a frenzy. They're closing all the beaches. But it might not be enough," Sarah finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Just then, Officer Ramirez burst into the room, his face flushed with exertion. "Doctor, we need your help. One of the injured divers just arrived. It's bad." Dr. Alvarez nodded, turning to leave. "I'll keep you updated," he promised before rushing out. Sarah and Mark exchanged worried glances. The horror they thought they'd escaped was far from over. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional updates from passing nurses. The entire hospital seemed to be on high alert, with staff rushing back and forth, urgent voices echoing down the corridors. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the hospital window, Sarah made a decision. "I need to see Carlos," she said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Mark looked alarmed. "Sarah, you shouldn't be walking on that leg." "Then find me a wheelchair," she said firmly. "I need to talk to him. He might know something that could help." Reluctantly, Mark helped her into a wheelchair and pushed her towards the ICU. As they approached Carlos's room, they could hear raised voices inside. "You can't be serious," Carlos was saying, his voice strained with pain and frustration. "I can't go out there like this." They entered to find Officer Ramirez standing at the foot of Carlos's bed, his expression pleading. "Carlos, you're the only one who really saw the shark up close. We need your expertise." Carlos's face was pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. His eyes flickered to his missing left arm, then back to the officer. "What do you expect me to do? I'm not exactly in fighting shape." "Carlos," Sarah interjected, wheeling herself closer to the bed. "What's going on?" Officer Ramirez turned to them, his face grim. "We're organizing a hunting party, professional shark hunters, along with some local fishermen who know these waters. But we need someone who's seen this particular shark." "You can't be serious," Mark said, echoing Carlos's earlier words. "He nearly died yesterday." "People are dying," Officer Ramirez shot back. "This shark, whatever it is, isn't stopping. We need to end this before more lives are lost." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah looked at Carlos, saw the conflict raging in his eyes. Despite his injury, despite the trauma he'd endured, she could see a part of him wanted to help. "I'll go," Sarah heard herself say. All eyes in the room turned to her in shock. "Absolutely not," Mark said immediately. "Sarah, you can't," Carlos added, his voice softer. "Your leg." "I saw it too," Sarah insisted. "Close just like you did, Carlos, and my leg will heal. I can sit on a boat and keep watch just as well as anyone else." Officer Ramirez looked thoughtful. "It could work," he mused. "Having someone who's encountered the shark could be invaluable." "This is insane," Mark protested. "Sarah, you're not thinking clearly. The trauma, the medication." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have since it happened," Sarah countered. "I can't just sit here in this hospital bed while that thing is out there, hurting more people. I need to do something." Carlos reached out with his remaining hand, grasping Sarah's. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Sarah nodded, squeezing his hand. "I'm sure. We started this together, we should finish it together." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Against the vehement protests of her doctors, Sarah was discharged into the care of the local authorities. She found herself on a large fishing boat, surrounded by grim-faced men armed with harpoons and high-powered rifles. Mark had refused to leave her side, his face a mask of worry as he helped her settle into a chair on the deck. "I still think this is a terrible idea," he muttered. "Noted," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sea looked deceptively calm, hiding the terror that lurked beneath its surface. As the boat chugged out of the harbor, Sarah felt a presence beside her. She looked up to see Carlos, pale and unsteady on his feet, but determined. "You should be in the hospital," she said softly. Carlos managed a weak smile. "So should you. But here we are." A gruff voice called out from the wheelhouse. "All right, listen up." A weathered man with a salt and pepper beard addressed the group. "Name's Captain Rodriguez. We're heading to the last known location of the attacks. Keep your eyes peeled for any sign of the shark, fin sightings, unusual water disturbances, anything." As the boat cut through the waves, Sarah felt a mix of fear and determination coursing through her. The memory of those cold, black eyes and rows of razor-sharp teeth was seared into her mind. But now, instead of paralyzing her, it fueled her resolve. Hours passed with no sign of the shark. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Sarah could feel her skin burning despite the sunscreen Mark had insisted on applying. Carlos sat beside her, his face drawn with pain but his eyes alert, scanning the waters. Suddenly, a shout came from the bow of the boat. "So, 3 o'clock." Everyone rushed to the starboard side, straining to see. Sarah's heart pounded as she spotted it. A large triangular fin cutting through the water, heading straight for the boat. "It's him," Carlos breathed, his voice tight with fear and recognition. Captain Rodriguez's voice boomed out. "Battle stations. Gunners ready." The next few moments were chaos. The shark circled the boat, its massive form visible just beneath the surface. Men shouted. Guns were fired, harpoons launched. But the shark was fast, impossibly so for its size. Sarah watched in horror as the creature rammed the boat, nearly capsizing it. She lost her balance, tumbling towards the edge. For one terrifying moment, she thought she would fall into the churning waters. A strong hand grasped her arm, pulling her back. She looked up to see Carlos, his face contorted with the effort of holding her with his one remaining arm. "I've got you," he grunted, dragging her to safety. Ring pain in her leg. She hobbled to the railing, took aim and fired. The flare hit the water just in front of the shark, exploding in a burst of red light. The massive predator veered off course, giving the men in the water time to be pulled to safety. "Good shot," Captain Rodriguez yelled. But there was no time for celebration. The shark was coming around again, its relentless pursuit unending. As it approached, Sarah caught a glimpse of its eyes, those same cold, black orbs that had haunted her nightmares. But this time, instead of fear, she felt a surge of defiance. "Come on, you bastard," she muttered under her breath. "Let's finish this." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, the battle for survival raged on. The shark, the boat, the hunters, and the survivors locked in a deadly dance upon the endless blue of the Caribbean Sea. And Sarah, her legs throbbing and her heart pounding, stood ready to face her nightmare head-on, determined to see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. The fading light of dusk cast long shadows across the deck of the fishing boat as it rocked violently in the churning waters. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Sarah gripped the railing tightly, her knuckles white, as she scanned the darkening sea for any sign of the monstrous shark. "Where is it?" she shouted over the din of shouting men and roaring engines. Carlos, pale and sweating from the exertion and pain, limped to her side. "I don't see it," he panted, his eyes darting across the waves. "But it's out there, waiting." Captain Rodriguez's gruff voice boomed from the wheelhouse. "Everyone, stay alert. This beast is smart. It's toying with us." As if in response to his words, a massive form suddenly breached the surface about 50 yards from the boat. For a brief, terrifying moment, Sarah saw the full length of the shark, easily 20 feet long, its gray skin scarred and pockmarked. Then it crashed back into the water, sending up a spray that reached all the way to the deck. "Jesus Christ," Mark breathed beside her. "It's even bigger than I remembered." A flurry of activity erupted on the boat. Men rushed to the sides, harpoons and rifles at the ready. But the shark had vanished again, leaving only ripples in its wake. "We can't keep this up much longer," Carlos said, his voice tight with pain and exhaustion. "The light's almost gone, and we're running low on fuel and ammunition." Sarah knew he was right. They had been out here for hours, locked in this deadly game of cat and mouse. The initial adrenaline rush had long since worn off, leaving her leg throbbing mercilessly. She could see the toll the pursuit was taking on everyone, the grim, tired faces of the fishermen, the tense set of Captain Rodriguez's shoulders as he peered into the gathering darkness. Suddenly, a cry went up from the bow. "Dale!" Port side. All eyes turned to the left of the boat, At first, Sarah saw nothing but choppy waves. Then she spotted it, a dark fin slicing through the water, heading straight for them. "Race for impact," Captain Rodriguez bellowed. The warning came just in time. The shark rammed the boat with bone-jarring force, nearly knocking Sarah off her feet. She stumbled, crying out as pain shot through her injured leg. Mark caught her before she could fall. "Sarah, are you okay?" Before she could answer, another impact rocked the boat. The sound of splintering would fill the air as the shark's massive jaws clamped down on the hull. "We're taking on water," someone shouted from below deck. Panic erupted. Men scrambled for life jackets and emergency flares. Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear she felt clawing at her own chest. Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone, calm down. We can still make it back to shore if we act fast." But even as he spoke, Sarah knew their chances were slim. The boat was listing heavily to one side, and the shore was miles away. And all the while, the shark continued to circle, its fin a constant reminder of the danger lurking just beneath the surface. Carlos gripped her arm, his face a mask of determination. "Sarah, listen to me. You need to get to one of the life rafts. You're injured. You need to get out of here." Sarah shook her head vehemently. "I'm not leaving. Not until this is finished." "Don't be stupid," Mark interjected. "This isn't the time for heroics. We need to evacuate now." As they argued, a hush fell over the boat. Sarah looked up to see all eyes fixed on a point just off the starboard side. There, barely visible in the fading light, was the shark. It was swimming slowly, almost lazily, its dorsal fin cutting a smooth line through the water. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah found herself locking eyes with the creature, those same cold, black orbs that had haunted her dreams. But this time, instead of fear, she felt something else. Rage, determination, a burning desire to end this, once and for all. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Sarah grabbed a harpoon from a nearby rack. She hefted it, feeling its weight, her mind racing. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Mark hissed, reaching for her. She shrugged him off. Finishing this. Before anyone could stop her, Sarah limped to the railing. The pain in her leg was excruciating, but she pushed through it, focused entirely on the shark. "Tane!" she shouted, her voice raw with emotion. "Remember me, you bastard?" The shark's path altered slightly, turning towards the sound of her voice. Sarah raised the harpoon, her arms shaking with the effort. "Sarah, don't!" Carlos called out, but it was too late. With all her strength, Sarah hurled the harpoon. It arced through the air, glinting in the last rays of sunlight. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she had missed. Then the harpoon plunged into the water, right where the shark's head should be. A roar went up from the men on the boat, but their cheers quickly turned to cries of alarm as the water around the shark erupted into a frothing maelstrom. "It's not dead," Captain Rodriguez shouted. "It's coming right for us." Sarah barely had time to register his words before the shark slammed into the boat with unprecedented force. The impact sent her flying. She hit the water hard, the cold shocking the breath from her lungs. Disoriented and in pain, Sarah struggled to the surface. She gasped for air, her eyes stinging from the salt water. Through the chaos, she heard voices calling her name. "Sarah, Sarah, where are you?" She tried to call out, but another wave crashed over her, pushing her back under. As she fought to resurface, Sarah felt something brush against her leg. Her heart nearly stopped as she realized what it was. The shark was right beneath her. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Sarah forced it down. She knew that thrashing would only attract the shark's attention. Instead, she tried to remain as still as possible, praying that the creature wouldn't notice her. Seconds stretched into an eternity as Sarah floated there, caught between the dangers above and below. Her lungs burned, demanding air, but she didn't dare move. Just when she thought she couldn't hold her breath any longer, strong arms wrapped around her. Pulling her up, she broke the surface with a gasp, coughing and sputtering. "I've got you," Mark's voice said in her ear. "Just hold on." Sarah clung to him as he swam them towards one of the life rafts that had been deployed. Hands reached down, sawing them aboard. As Sarah collapsed onto the bottom of the raft, she became aware of the commotion around her. The fishing boat was rapidly sinking, men jumping into the water and swimming for the life rafts. And there, in the middle of it all, was the shark, still thrashing, the harpoon protruding from its side. "Is everyone accounted for?" Captain Rodriguez called out as he climbed into their raft. A quick head count revealed that most had made it to the rafts, but one face was noticeably absent. "Where's Carlos?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse. A grim silence fell over the group. Sarah scanned the waters frantically, searching for any sign of him. Then she saw it, a flash of movement in the water, not far from where the shark was still thrashing. It was Carlos, struggling to stay afloat with only one arm. "There," Sarah pointed. "We have to help him." But even as she spoke, she saw the shark's fin turn towards Carlos. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah watched in horror, unable to do anything but scream a warning that she knew would come too late. What happened next would be seared into Sarah's memory forever. Just as the shark was about to reach Carlos, a small speedboat came roaring onto the scene. At its helm was Dr. Alvarez, of all people. The doctor maneuvered his boat between Carlos and the shark, reaching down to haul the injured man aboard. The shark, enraged, slammed into the speedboat, but Dr. Alvarez was ready. As the creature reared up for another attack, the doctor produced a flare gun and fired directly into the shark's open mouth. A deafening roar filled the air as the shark thrashed in agony, blood and smoke pouring from its jaws. It twisted and turned, its movements becoming more erratic by the second. "Look out!" Mark shouted as the shark's massive tail whipped towards their raft. Sarah felt the impact, heard the sound of tearing rubber. Then she was in the water again, the cold shocking her system. She flailed, disoriented, unsure which way was up. Strong hands grabbed her, pulling her to the surface. It was Captain Rodriguez, his weathered face a mask of determination. "Hold on," she growled. "It's almost over." And indeed it was. As Sarah watched, the shark's movements began to slow. Its thrashing became weaker, its circles tighter. Finally, with one last mighty convulsion, it rolled onto its side and began to sink. A cheer went up from the survivors, a sound of relief and disbelief. But Sarah couldn't join in. She was too focused on the speedboat, where Dr. Alvarez was performing CPR on Carlos's still form. "Trees," she whispered, though to whom she wasn't sure. "Please let him be okay." As if in answer to her plea, Carlos suddenly coughed, water spewing from his mouth. Dr. Alvarez helped him sit up, relief evident on both their faces. The next few hours passed in a blur. The Coast Guard arrived, alerted by the emergency beacon from the sunken fishing boat. The survivors were pulled from the water, wrapped in blankets, and loaded onto rescue boats. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Sarah found herself on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter, heading back to shore. She sat between Mark and Carlos, all three wrapped in thick blankets, sipping hot coffee. "I still can't believe you came out there," Sarah said to Dr. Alvarez, who was checking Carlos's vital signs. The doctor shrugged, a wry smile on his face. "When I heard what you all were planning, I knew you'd need medical assistance. I couldn't just sit in the hospital and wait." Carlos chuckled weakly. "Looks like we all played the hero today." Sarah nodded, her gaze drawn to the horizon, where the first golden rays of sunlight were touching the calm sea. The nightmare was over, but she knew its effects would linger. They had all been changed by this experience, marked in ways both visible and invisible. As the shoreline of Playa del Carmen came into view, Sarah felt a mix of emotions wash over her: relief, exhaustion, lingering fear, and something else. A sense of strength, perhaps, of survival against impossible odds. "What happens now?" Mark asked quietly. Sarah took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in her ribs. "Now," she said, "we heal, we rest, and we never take a single moment for granted ever again." As the boat docked and they were helped onto solid ground, Sarah knew that the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. The physical wounds would heal, but the emotional scars would take much longer to fade. But looking at the faces of her fellow survivors, Carlos, Mark, Captain Rodriguez, and the others, she knew they would face whatever came next together. The terror that had lurked beneath the tranquil waters of Playa del Carmen had been defeated, but its memory would live on, a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable danger. The Playa del Carmen marina bustled with frantic activity as the Coast Guard cutter docked. Emergency vehicles, their lights flashing, lined the shore. A crowd had gathered, held back by a hastily erected police cordon. The air was thick with tension and the clamor of voices. Sarah winced as she was helped onto the dock, her injured leg buckling slightly under her weight. Mark was at her side instantly, supporting her. "Easy does it," he murmured, his arm around her waist. As they made their way down the gangplank, Sarah was struck by the cacophony of noise and activity. Paramedics rushed forward, their faces edged with concern. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashing incessantly. Police officers struggled to maintain order. "Ms. Matthews, can you tell us what happened out there? Is it true that you killed the shark? How many casualties were there?" The barrage of questions made Sarah's head spin. She stumbled, overwhelmed by the sensory overload. "Back off," Mark shouted at the press, his voice uncharacteristically harsh. "Can't you see she needs medical attention?" A team of paramedics pushed through the crowd, led by a petite woman with kind eyes. "I'm Maria," she said, helping Sarah onto a waiting stretcher. "We're going to take good care of you, okay?" Sarah nodded numbly, her eyes searching the crowd. She spotted Carlos being helped into another ambulance, Dr. Alvarez at his side. Their eyes met briefly, a silent understanding passing between them. As the paramedics began to wheel her towards an ambulance, Sarah caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Mrs. Hernandez, the mother of the teenage boy from the original snorkeling trip, was pushing her way forward. "Sarah," she called out, her voice breaking. "Sarah, please. How is Carlos? Is he?" Sarah reached out, catching the woman's hand as she passed. "He's alive," she assured her. "He's hurt, but he's alive." Relief washed over Mrs. Hernandez's face, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank God," she whispered. Thank you for going back out there." Before Sarah could respond, she was being loaded into the ambulance. The doors closed, muffling the chaos outside. In the sudden quiet, the events of the past 24 hours came crashing down on her. Sarah began to shake uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay," Maria soothed, placing a warm hand on her arm. "You're safe now. Let it out." The ride to the hospital passed in a blur. Sarah was vaguely aware of Maria checking her vitals, asking her questions, but she couldn't seem to focus. Her mind kept replaying fragments of the ordeal. The shark's dead eyes, the splintering of wood as it rammed the boat, Carlos's pale face as he was pulled from the water. At the hospital, Sarah was whisked into the emergency room. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her, their voices a jumble of English and Spanish. She caught snippets of their conversation. Possible fracture. Signs of hypothermia. Need to check for internal bleeding. Through it all, Sarah kept asking about the others. Carlos, Mark, are they okay? A doctor with salt and pepper hair leaned over her, his face kind but serious. "Ms. Matthews, I'm Dr. Ramirez. I need you to focus on yourself right now. Your friends are being taken care of, I promise. But you've been through a traumatic experience, and we need to make sure you're all right. Sarah wanted to argue, to demand more information, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking her. As a nurse inserted an IV into her arm, she felt herself drifting off, the world fading to black around her. When Sarah awoke, the room was quiet save for the steady beep of a heart monitor. Sunlight streamed through a window, indicating that several hours had passed. She blinked, trying to orient herself. "Welcome back," a familiar voice said. Sarah turned her head to see Mark sitting in a chair beside her bed. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, but he managed a small smile. "How long was I out?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse. "About 6 hours," Mark replied. "The doctors said you needed the rest." Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "Carlos? The others?" Mark's expression grew somber. "Carlos is in surgery. They're trying to save what's left of his arm." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Everyone else made it. Some injuries, but nothing life-threatening." Sarah nodded, processing the information. "And the shark? Dead," Mark confirmed. "They found its body washed up on a beach about a mile from where we were. The local authorities are all over it. Scientists too. They're saying it might be some kind of mutant species or something." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at the door. Officer Ramirez entered, looking as tired as Sarah felt. "Ms. Matthews," he said, nodding respectfully. "I'm glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I got chewed up and spit out by a shark," Sarah replied dryly. Officer Ramirez chuckled humorlessly. "I can imagine. Listen, I hate to do this now, but we need to get your official statement about what happened out there. The press is going crazy, and we need to get ahead of the story." Sarah sighed, closing her eyes briefly. "Can't it wait?" "I'm afraid not," Officer Ramirez said apologetically. "The mayor is holding a press conference in an hour, and we need to have all the facts straight." For the next 45 minutes, Sarah recounted the events of the past day in painstaking detail. She described the initial attack, the frantic escape back to shore, the decision to go back out and hunt the shark, and the final, terrifying confrontation. Officer Ramirez listened intently, occasionally interrupting to ask for clarification. As Sarah finished her account, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. The door burst open, and a harried-looking nurse rushed in. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said breathlessly, "but I thought you'd want to know. Carlos is out of surgery." Sarah's heart leapt. "Is he okay?" The nurse nodded, a small smile on her face. "He's stable. The doctors were able to save more of his arm than they initially thought. He's in recovery now." Relief washed over Sarah. She hadn't realized how worried she'd been until that moment. Officer Ramirez stood, straightening his uniform. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Matthews. Your statement will be invaluable in our investigation." He paused at the door, turning back to face her. "What you did out there, it was incredibly brave. Reckless, perhaps, but brave. This town owes you a debt of gratitude." As the officer left, Sarah slumped back against her pillows, suddenly exhausted again. Mark took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You should rest," he said softly. "It's been a hell of a day." Sarah shook her head. "I want to see Carlos. I need to know he's really okay." Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's expression must have convinced him. "All right," he conceded. "Let me find a wheelchair." A few minutes later, Sarah found herself being wheeled through the hospital corridors. The place was a hive of activity, nurses and doctors rushing back and forth. As they passed the waiting room, Sarah caught glimpses of familiar faces. The honeymooning couple huddled together on a small couch, the older man with the camera talking quietly with a police officer. They arrived at the recovery ward, where a nurse stopped them. "I'm sorry," she said, "but Mr. Morales is still unconscious. Only family is allowed in at this time." Sarah felt a surge of frustration. "Please," she pleaded. "We went through hell together. I just need to see that he's okay." The nurse hesitated, then relented. 5 minutes, she said firmly. No more. As they entered Carlos's room, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He looked so small lying there, hooked up to various machines. His left arm, or what was left of it, was heavily bandaged and elevated on a pillow. Sarah wheeled herself to his bedside, taking his right hand in hers. "Oh, Carlos," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." To her surprise, Carlos's eyes fluttered open. He blinked a few times, focusing on her face. "Sarah?" he croaked. "I'm here," she said, squeezing his hand. "You're going to be okay." A ghost of a smile crossed Carlos's face. "We did it," he murmured. "We got the bastard." Sarah nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. "We did. It's over now." Carlos's eyes drifted closed again, the medication pulling him back under. But his hand remained clasped in Sarah's, a tangible connection between two survivors. As Mark wheeled her back to her room, Sarah's mind was whirling. The immediate danger had passed, but she knew the aftermath was just beginning. There would be investigations, medical treatments, psychological evaluations. The tranquil beach vacation she had planned seemed like a lifetime ago. Back in her room, Sarah found Dr. Ramirez waiting for her. His face was grave as he explained her injuries. A hairline fracture in her leg, bruised ribs, various cuts and abrasions. "You'll need to stay here for a few more days," he said, "and there will be physical therapy after that. But considering what you went through, you're incredibly lucky." Lucky. The word echoed in Sarah's mind as she lay in her hospital bed that night, unable to sleep. Was she lucky? She had survived, yes. But at what cost? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shark's massive form cutting through the water. She felt the terror of those moments when she thought death was certain. As dawn broke over Playa del Carmen, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't change what had happened, couldn't erase the trauma of the past days, but she could choose how to move forward. She would heal both physically and mentally. She would make sure Carlos got the best care possible. And she would tell their story, not for fame or glory, but to ensure that something like this never happened again. The shark was gone, but its impact would be felt for a long time to come. As Sarah watched the sun rise over the Caribbean, she knew that her life had been irrevocably changed. The peaceful waters that had once promised relaxation and adventure now held a darker significance. But she had survived. They had survived. And in that survival, there was hope for whatever came next. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled Sarah's hospital room, a constant reminder of the ordeal she had survived. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the sterile white walls. Sarah lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the past few days in an endless loop. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Dr. Ramirez entered, his face etched with a mixture of concern and determination. "Good morning, Ms. Matthews," he said, approaching her bedside. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah attempted a smile, but it felt forced. "About as well as can be expected, I suppose. Any news on Carlos?" Dr. Ramirez's expression softened. "That's actually why I'm here. Carlos is being prepped for another surgery as we speak. The damage to his arm was extensive. We're doing everything we can, but..." He trailed off, but Sarah understood the unspoken implications. She swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "Can I see him before the surgery?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "I'll arrange it, but Sarah, you need to prepare yourself. It's not going to be easy." As Dr. Ramirez left to make the arrangements, Sarah's mind wandered back to the moment when Carlos had pushed her to safety, seconds before the shark attacked him. The guilt was overwhelming. A few minutes later, a nurse arrived with a wheelchair. With some difficulty, Sarah maneuvered herself into it, wincing at the pain in her leg. As they made their way to the pre-op area, Sarah's heart raced with anticipation and fear. They found Carlos lying on a gurney, his face pale and drawn. His left arm was heavily bandaged, but Sarah could see the extent of the damage. It was shorter than it should be, ending abruptly just below the elbow. "Carlos," Sarah whispered, reaching out to take his right hand. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face. A weak smile played at his lips. "Sarah, you're okay. Thanks to you," she said, her voice breaking. "Carlos, I'm so sorry. If I hadn't drifted away from the group dash—" "Stop," Carlos interrupted, his voice firm despite his weakened state. "This isn't your fault. We both know the risks of the ocean. I don't regret what I did." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "But your arm dash is a small price to pay for saving a life," Carlos finished. He squeezed her hand weakly. "Promise me something, Sarah. Don't let this define you. Don't let fear win." Before Sarah could respond, a team of nurses entered, preparing to take Carlos to surgery. As they wheeled him away, Carlos managed one last smile. "See you on the other side," he said. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Sarah's life. She sat in the waiting room, surrounded by other survivors of the attack. Mark hadn't left her side, his steady presence a comfort in the storm of emotions. The honeymooning couple, Lisa and David, sat huddled together on a small couch. The older man with the camera, whom Sarah now knew as Gerald, paced back and forth, his camera hanging unused around his neck. "I can't believe this is happening," Lisa said, breaking the tense silence. "We were supposed to be on our honeymoon. Now—" She trailed off, burying her face in David's shoulder. Gerald stopped his pacing, turning to face the group. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," he said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and determination. "The authorities, the resort, they need to be held accountable." "It wasn't their fault," Sarah found herself saying. All eyes turned to her. "The shark? It wasn't normal. No one could have predicted this." "Maybe not," Gerald conceded, "but they could have been better prepared. There should have been better safety measures, faster response times." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Officer Ramirez. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept in days. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, addressing the group. "I wanted to update you on the investigation." Sarah straightened in her wheelchair, suddenly alert. "What have you found out?" Officer Ramirez pulled up a chair, his expression grave. "The shark has been examined by marine biologists from the university. They've confirmed it was a bull shark, but there were anomalies." "What kind of anomalies?" Mark asked, leaning forward. "Genetic mutations," Officer Ramirez explained. "They're still running tests, but preliminary results suggest the shark may have been exposed to some kind of chemical pollutant. It caused accelerated growth and increased aggression." A heavy silence fell over the group as they processed this information. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that human activity might have created this monster was almost too much to bear. "What happens now?" David asked, his arm tightened protectively around Lisa. Officer Ramirez sighed. "We're launching a full investigation into potential sources of pollution in the area. In the meantime, all beaches within a 50-mile radius have been closed. We can't risk another incident." As the officer continued to explain the steps being taken, Sarah's mind drifted. She thought of the crystal-clear waters that had seemed so inviting just days ago. Now, they held a hidden menace, a danger lurking beneath the surface that she would never be able to forget. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Ramirez. All eyes turned to him, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "Carlos is out of surgery," he announced. "It was touch and go for a while, but he's stable now. We weren't able to save the arm below the elbow, but we managed to preserve some function in the upper arm." A collective sigh of relief swept through the group. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. a mixture of gratitude that Carlos had survived and sorrow for what he had lost. "Can we see him?" she asked. Dr. Ramirez nodded. "He's in recovery now. He'll be groggy from the anesthesia, but you can visit briefly. 2 at a time, please." Sarah looked at Mark, who nodded in understanding. He helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way to the recovery room. Carlos lay in the hospital bed, his skin pale against the white sheets. His left arm was heavily bandaged, ending abruptly mid-forearm. Despite the tubes and wires connecting him to various machines, he looked peaceful. As Sarah approached the bed, Carlos's eyes fluttered open. He blinked a few times, focusing on her face. "Hey there, hero," Sarah said softly, taking his right hand in hers. A weak smile played at Carlos's lips. "Look who's talking," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "How are you feeling?" Mark asked, standing at the foot of the bed. Carlos's gaze drifted to his bandaged arm. "Like I picked a fight with a shark," he said, attempting humor despite the gravity of the situation. "Did we win?" Sarah nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We did. It's over, Carlos. You're safe now." Carlos closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "Good. That's kind." As Carlos drifted back to sleep, Sarah felt a wave of emotions wash over her. Relief, guilt, fear, gratitude. They swirled together in a confusing maelstrom. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Sarah divided her time between physical therapy sessions for her injured leg and visits to Carlos's room. The other survivors stopped by regularly, a sense of camaraderie developing between them all. One afternoon, as Sarah sat by Carlos's bed, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Raised voices could be heard, growing louder as they approached. "You can't keep us out. The public has a right to know." The door burst open, and a man with a camera pushed his way in, followed closely by a woman holding a microphone. Behind them, a flustered nurse tried to intervene. "Sarah Matthews? Carlos Morales? I'm Javier Ruiz from Channel 5 News. Can you tell us about your encounter with the shark? How does it feel to be hailed as heroes?" Sarah froze, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion. Carlos, however, found his voice. "Get out," he said, his tone cold and firm despite his weakened state. "We're not your story." The reporter opened his mouth to argue, but was cut off by the arrival of hospital security. As the media team was escorted out, Sarah could hear them protesting about freedom of the press and the public's right to information. Once they were gone, Sarah turned to Carlos, her expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Are you okay?" Carlos nodded, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. I'm not ready for that. To be some kind of spectacle." Sarah understood all too well. The idea of reliving their ordeal for the entertainment of others was nauseating, but she also knew that their story would come out one way or another. Perhaps it was better to control the narrative themselves. That evening, as Sarah lay in her hospital bed, unable to sleep, she made a decision. Reaching for the notepad and pen on her bedside table, she began to write. She wrote about the initial attack, the terror of those moments in the water. She wrote about the decision to go back out, to face the nightmare head-on. She wrote about Carlos's bravery, about the moment when all seemed lost. But she also wrote about the aftermath, the pain both physical and emotional, the nightmares that plagued her sleep, the way she flinched at the sound of running water. She wrote about the survivor's guilt, the what-ifs that haunted her thoughts. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Sarah set down her pen. She had filled pages, pouring out her heart and soul onto the paper. It wasn't a heroic tale of man versus nature. It was a raw, honest account of trauma and survival. Later that morning, Sarah asked Mark to bring her laptop to the hospital. With shaking hands, she typed up her handwritten notes, expanding on them, refining the narrative. When she was finished, she had a document that was part personal essay, part cautionary tale. She showed it to Carlos first, watching his face carefully as he read. When he finished, he looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "This is it," he said softly. "This is what people need to see. Not some sensationalized news story, but the truth." With Carlos's blessing, Sarah shared the document with the other survivors. Each of them added their own perspectives, their own experiences. What emerged was a powerful, multifaceted account of their ordeal. It was Gerald who suggested reaching out to a reputable journalist he knew. "Someone who will treat the story with the respect it deserves," he explained. And so, on the day before Sarah was due to be discharged from the hospital, they gathered in Carlos's room. The journalist, a compassionate woman named Elena, listened intently as they shared their story. She asked thoughtful questions, never pushing too hard when emotions ran high. As Elena prepared to leave, she turned to the group. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. "I promise to do your story justice, not as a tale of adventure or heroism, but as a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances." That night, as Sarah packed her few belongings in preparation for leaving the hospital, she felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief at the prospect of going home, but also fear. The hospital had become a safe haven, a place where she was surrounded by people who understood what she had been through. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mark, a small smile on his face. "Ready to get out of here?" he asked. Sarah nodded, attempting a smile of her own. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." As Mark helped her with her bag, Sarah took one last look around the room that had been her home for the past week. So much had changed in such a short time. She wasn't the same person who had arrived in Playa del Carmen, excited for a carefree beach vacation. That Sarah was gone, replaced by someone who understood all too well the fragility of life and the power of nature. But as she wheeled herself out of the room, Sarah realized something. She was stronger now, too. She had faced her worst nightmare and survived. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges both physical and emotional. But she wasn't alone. She had Carlos, Mark, and the other survivors. They were bound together now, not just by their shared trauma, but by their determination to move forward. As they made their way through the hospital corridors, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a window. The woman looking back at her was battered and bruised, but there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The shark may have taken much from them, but it hadn't taken everything. They were still here, still fighting. And as Sarah stepped out into the warm Mexican sun, she made a silent promise to herself and to Carlos. They would not let fear win. They would heal, they would adapt, and they would live. The nightmare was over, but the journey of recovery was just beginning, and Sarah was ready to face it head-on, one day at a time. The sun had barely risen over Playa del Carmen when Sarah awoke, drenched in sweat and heart pounding. The nightmare that had jolted her from sleep was already fading, but the fear lingered, a constant companion since the attack. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was safe in her hotel room, far from the waters where the nightmare had unfolded. A soft knock at the door made her jump. "Sarah, are you awake?" Mark's voice came through, concern evident in his tone. "Yeah, come in," she called back, pushing herself up to a sitting position and wincing at the pain in her leg. Mark entered, carrying a tray with coffee and what looked like local pastries. His face softened with sympathy as he took in her appearance. "Another rough night?" Sarah nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Does it show that much?" "Only to someone who knows what to look for," Mark replied, settling into a chair next to her bed. "The nightmares? They're not getting any better, are they?" Sarah shook her head, taking a sip of the strong, bitter coffee. "If anything, they're getting worse. It's not just the shark anymore. Sometimes it's Carlos bleeding out in the water. Sometimes it's you or the others." Her voice trailed off as she fought back tears. Mark reached out, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "Have you thought about talking to someone? There's a trauma counselor at the hospital who I'm fine, Sarah interrupted, more sharply than she intended. Seeing the hurt look on Mark's face, she softened her tone. I'm sorry. I need to process this in my own way, you know? Mark nodded, though his expression remained concerned. I understand. Just remember you're not alone in this. We're all here for you. As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Lisa, the honeymooning bride who had been part of their ill-fated snorkeling trip. Breakfast in an hour? The whole group's meeting in the hotel restaurant. Sarah hesitated, her instinct to isolate herself warring with the knowledge that she needed support. Finally, she typed back a quick, "I'll be there," before setting the phone aside. "The others want to meet for breakfast," she explained to Mark. "I guess I should start getting ready." Mark stood, gathering the now empty coffee cups. "That's great, Sarah. It'll be good for you to get out of this room for a bit. Do you need help with anything?" Sarah shook her head, already dreading the ordeal of showering and dressing with her injured leg. "I've got it. Thanks, Mark, for everything." An hour later, Sarah made her way slowly to the hotel restaurant, leaning heavily on her crutches. The place was bustling with tourists, their carefree laughter a stark contrast to the somber mood that settled over her as she approached the table where her fellow survivors sat. Carlos was there, his left arm ending abruptly below the elbow, the sleeve of his shirt neatly pinned up. He offered Sarah a wan smile as she approached. "Good morning, Sarah. It's good to see you up and about." Sarah settled into an empty chair, propping her crutches against the table. "Thanks, Carlos. How are you feeling?" He shrugged, a gesture that looked oddly lopsided now. "Taking it one day at a time. The physical therapy is challenging, but I'm alive, which is more than I could have hoped for at one point." The others murmured in agreement. Gerald, the older man with the camera, raised his coffee cup in a small salute. "To survival," he said quietly. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than Sarah had expected. They talked about their recovery, shared stories of well-meaning but clueless friends and family, and even Menuk, Ed, to laugh at some of the more absurd moments of their shared ordeal. It was Lisa who finally broached the subject they'd all been avoiding. "So," she said, setting down her fork, "have you all seen the news?" Attention settled over the table. Sarah had been deliberately avoiding all media since leaving the hospital, but she knew the others hadn't been as successful. "It's a circus out there," David, Lisa's husband, said with disgust. "Every news outlet is clamoring for exclusive interviews, calling us heroes, survivors, thrill seekers. It's like they can't decide if we're victims or daredevils." Gerald nodded grimly. "I've had 3 book offers and a movie deal proposal. Can you believe it? They want to turn our trauma into entertainment." Sarah felt a surge of anger. Don't they understand what we went through? What we're still going through? "That's why we need to control the narrative," a new voice said. They all turned to see Elena, the journalist they had spoken to in the hospital, approaching their table. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I saw you all here and, well, I have some news." Elena pulled up a chair, her expression serious. "The article is ready to go to print. I wanted you all to see it first, to make sure you're comfortable with how your story is being told." She pulled out several copies of a draft, passing them around the table. Sarah took hers with trembling hands, almost afraid to read it. For several minutes, the only sound was the rustle of paper and the ambient noise of the restaurant. Sarah read through the article, her heart pounding. Elena had done an incredible job. The piece was raw, honest, and unflinching in its portrayal of their ordeal and its aftermath. It didn't shy away from the terror they had experienced, nor did it glorify their actions. Instead, it painted a complex picture of human resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances. As Sarah finished reading, she looked up to see similar expressions of emotion on the faces of her fellow survivors. Carlos was the first to speak, his voice thick with feeling. "Gus, this is perfect, Elena. Thank you for treating our story with such respect. The others murmured in agreement. Sarah found herself nodding, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Elena smiled, relief evident on her face. I'm glad you approve. The article will be published tomorrow. I hope it will help people understand what you've been through, and maybe even spark some important conversations about ocean conservation and safety. As Elena left, promising to send them the final published version, a thoughtful silence fell over the group. It was Gerald who finally broke it. You know, he said slowly, maybe this is our chance to make something good come out of all this. Sarah looked at him quizzically. What do you mean? Gerald leaned forward, his eyes alight with purpose. We survived something incredible. Terrible, yes, but also incredible. We have a platform now, a chance to make our voices heard. What if we used it to advocate for better safety measures, for more research into marine life and the effects of pollution? The idea took root, growing as they discussed it. By the time they finished their breakfast, a plan was forming. They would use their newfound notoriety to raise awareness, to push for change. It wouldn't erase what had happened to them, but it might prevent others from suffering a similar fate. As they left the restaurant, Sarah felt a glimmer of something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Tolt. The road ahead was still long and difficult, but for the first time since the attack, she felt like she had a purpose. Back in her room, Sarah opened her laptop, determination fueling her actions. She began to research marine conservation organizations, ocean safety protocols, and the latest studies on the effects of pollution on marine life. As she worked, she felt some of the helplessness that had plagued her since the attack began to fade. A knock at her door interrupted her focus. It was Carlos, looking tired but resolute. Can we talk? He asked. Sarah nodded, gesturing for him to enter. Carlos sat on the edge of her bed, his expression serious. I've been thinking about what Gerald said. He began. About using our experience to make a difference. I want to do more than just give interviews or make speeches. I want to get back in the water. Sarah felt a jolt of fear at his words. Carlos, are you sure that's a good idea? After everything that happened. He held up his hand, stopping her. I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. I've been a guide for years. I know these waters, I know the marine life. What if I used that knowledge to help with research? To work with marine biologists studying the effects of pollution, or tracking shark populations? As Carlos spoke, Sarah could see the passion in his eyes. Despite everything he had lost, he was still determined to make a difference. It was inspiring and a little terrifying. I think it's incredible that you want to do this, Sarah said slowly. But Carlos, aren't you scared? He nodded, a wry smile twisting his lips. Terrified, but I can't let that fear control me. We survived, Sarah. Now we have to live. His words struck a chord deep within her. Sarah thought about the research she had been doing, about the plans they had made at breakfast. She thought about the nightmares that still plagued her, the way she flinched at the sound of running water. You're right, she said finally. We can't let fear win. But Carlos, promise me you'll be careful. I couldn't bear it if... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Carlos reached out, taking her hand in his. Promise. And who knows? Maybe someday you'll join me out there. The idea sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, but she didn't dismiss it outright. Instead, she squeezed Carlos's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared trauma and their determination to move forward. As Carlos left, Sarah turned back to her laptop. She had work to do. There were organizations to contact, statements to prepare, a future to plan. The shark attack had changed her life irrevocably, but she was beginning to realize that change didn't have to be entirely negative. She was a survivor, yes, but more than that, she was a voice for change, an advocate for safety and conservation. The nightmare in the waters off Playa del Carmen had ended, but a new chapter was just beginning. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers poised over the keyboard. It was time to turn their trauma into triumph. their fear into fuel for change. With renewed purpose, she began to type, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months had passed since the fateful day in Playa del Carmen, but for Sarah Matthews, the memories remained as vivid as ever. She stood at the edge of the beach near her San Diego home, toes curling in the cold sand as she gazed out at the Pacific Ocean. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore no longer filled her with the terror it once had, but a lingering unease remained, a constant reminder of what she had endured. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. With determination etched on her face, she began to walk towards the water, her gait slightly uneven due to her prosthetic leg. The doctors had done an excellent job, but learning to walk again had been a grueling process, both physically and emotionally. As the first tendrils of water lapped at her feet, Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing just as her therapist had taught her. "You're doing great, Sarah," a familiar voice called from behind her. Sarah turned to see Mark jogging towards her, a proud smile on his face. He had been her rock throughout the recovery process, never wavering in his support. "Thanks," Sarah replied, managing a small smile of her own. "It's still not easy, but I'm getting there." Mark reached her side, gently taking her hand in his. "One step at a time, remember? There's no rush." They stood there together, letting the water wash over their feet. For Sarah, each moment was a small victory against the fear that had threatened to consume her. After a few minutes, they made their way back up the beach, settling onto a blanket Mark had laid out. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming video call. It was Carlos. "Hey, you too," Carlos greeted as his face appeared on the screen. He looked tanned and healthy, a far cry from the pale, injured man Sarah had last seen in the hospital. "How's the beach therapy going?" Sarah held up the phone so Carlos could see the ocean behind them. "Baby steps, but I made it to the water today. How about you? How's the research going?" Carlos's face lit up with enthusiasm. "It's incredible, Sarah. We're making real progress in understanding the long-term effects of chemical pollutants on shark behavior. And get this, we're presenting our findings at a major marine biology conference next month." "That's fantastic, Carlos," Sarah exclaimed, genuinely happy for her friend. "I knew you'd turn this into something positive." Carlos's expression softened. "We all have, Sarah. Your advocacy work has been making waves, you know." Excuse the pun. Sarah felt a flush of pride. In the months since the attack, she had thrown herself into ocean safety and conservation efforts. Her story, along with those of the other survivors, had sparked a global conversation about the importance of protecting marine ecosystems. "Thanks, Carlos. It helps to feel like I'm making a difference," Sarah said. "Oh, before I forget, Lisa and David wanted me to tell you they're expecting. Can you believe it?" Carlos's eyes widened in surprise. "Wow, that's wonderful news. Life goes on, doesn't it?" As they chatted, catching up on the lives of their fellow survivors, Sarah felt a familiar mix of emotions wash over her. There was sadness for what they had all lost, pride in how far they had come, and a lingering anxiety that she suspected would never fully disappear. After saying goodbye to Carlos, Sarah leaned back on the blanket, staring up at the cloudless sky. Mark lay beside her, their shoulders just touching. "Tenny, for your thoughts?" he asked softly. Sarah sighed. "I was just thinking about how much has changed. Sometimes it feels like that day in Playa del Carmen was a lifetime ago, and sometimes it feels like yesterday." Mark nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The scars remain, both the visible and invisible ones. But Sarah, look at how far you've come. You're here on the beach. You're helping others. You're living." "I know," Sarah said, turning to face him. "And I'm grateful, I really am. It's just, I can't help but wonder sometimes. You know, what if we had never gone on that snorkeling trip? What if I hadn't drifted away from the group?" Mark propped himself up on one elbow, his expression serious. Sarah, we can't change what happened, but we can choose how we move forward. And from where I'm standing, you're doing an amazing job of that." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the support and love Mark had shown her throughout this ordeal. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification. The sender was Elena, the journalist who had first told their story. Sarah sat up, opening the email with slightly trembling fingers. As she read, her eyes widened. "Mark," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "They want to make a documentary. About us, about what happened, about the work we're doing now." Mark sat up, reading over her shoulder. "Wow, that's big, Sarah. How do you feel about it?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. The idea of reliving that terrible day for the cameras was daunting. But if it could help raise awareness, if it could prevent even one person from experiencing what they had, "I think we should do it," she said finally. "But only if everyone agrees. We started this together, we should continue together." Over the next few weeks, Sarah coordinated with the other survivors. To her surprise, they were all on board with the documentary idea. Even Gerald, who had been the most reluctant to speak publicly about their experience, saw the value in sharing their story on a larger scale. The day filming began was emotionally charged. Sarah found herself back in Playa del Carmen, standing on the same beach where their nightmare had begun. The camera crew kept a respectful distance as she, Mark, Carlos, and the others retraced their steps. "It was a beautiful day," Sarah began, her voice steady as she spoke to the camera. "The kind of day where you think nothing could possibly go wrong." As they recounted their story, Sarah was struck by how much healing had occurred. Yes, the pain was still there, the fear still lingered, but it no longer defined them. They had taken their trauma and turned it into a force for change. During a break in filming, Sarah found herself standing at the water's edge, much as she had been that fateful day 6 months ago. But this time, instead of excitement about the snorkeling trip to come, she felt a complex mix of emotions: respect for the ocean's power, gratitude for her survival, and a fierce determination to protect this environment and those who enjoyed it. Carlos joined her, his prosthetic arm glinting in the sunlight. "Quite a view, isn't it?" he said, gazing out at the horizon. Sarah nodded. "It's beautiful and terrifying, both at the same time. Life's like that sometimes," Carlos mused. "Beautiful and terrifying. The trick is to keep moving forward, even when you're scared." As if to demonstrate his point, Carlos began to walk into the water. Sarah watched, her heart racing, as he waded in up to his waist. "Come on," he called back to her. "The water's fine." Sarah hesitated, fear warring with the desire to overcome it. She thought about how far she had come, about the work she had done, about the lives that might be saved by their story. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward. The cold water lapped at her feet, then her calves, then her thighs. By the time she reached Carlos, she was shaking, but not from fear alone. There was exhilaration too, a sense of triumph. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "We really did it." Carlos smiled, throwing his good arm around her shoulders. "We sure did, and we're not done yet." As they stood there, two survivors finding strength in the very environment that had nearly destroyed them, Sarah felt a shift within herself. The scars remained, yes, both physical and emotional, but they were no longer wounds. They were badges of survival, testaments to the strength of the human spirit. The shark attack had changed her life irrevocably. But standing here, in the waters off Playa del Carmen, Sarah realized that change had ultimately been for the better. She was stronger now, more aware, more alive. As they made their way back to shore, where the rest of their group waited with proud smiles, Sarah knew that this was more than just the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with purpose, hope, and the unshakable bond of shared experience. The nightmare was over, the healing would continue, and Sarah Matthews, along with her fellow survivors, would face whatever came next with courage, determination, and the knowledge that they had stared death in the face and emerged not just alive, but triumphant.